Welcome back to your show, Identities Umhlobo, where I'm talking to Jennifer Savage from the U.S. Embassy. She's the number 2 at the U.S. Embassy. Madam Savage, before we went on break, we started talking about the issue of sanctions, where you told us that sanctions are basically targeted, because for me, as a human rights activist who's working with girls and women and the vulnerable communities, we are feeling that we feel the sanctions. And then you spoke about how these are targeted. And then there's ZIDERA. We're hoping that you can quickly explain ZIDERA to us, but also as part of what I've heard and experienced, or maybe part of what I've heard from colleagues who work in human rights, has been that part of what the sanctions or ZIDERA have done has been the inability to easily trade. So for instance, the difficulty of any company in America. So if you are going to engage within a company or organization, the nostro accounts issues, it's been difficult, you know. So maybe you can define ZIDERA for us and how it's, you know, panning out.
Sure. So ZIDERA is a law that requires that Zimbabwe make political and economic reforms before the United States will allow new lending on the part of the World Bank or the IMF. It is not about sanctions against individuals or about U.S. relations or U.S. banking with Zimbabwe. It simply says that in the IMF and in the World Bank, we will vote against new lending to Zimbabwe until we see political and economic reforms made. And this is actually a law that has actually never been enacted, never been implemented, because Zimbabwe has been so far in arrears to the World Bank and to IMF that they've never been eligible for new lending at all. We're at an exciting point now. It's a critical point. It's a I think, very frightening and difficult point for many Zimbabweans who are feeling the economic hardship right now. But Minister Ngube seems to have a plan to pay arrears and may indeed make Zimbabwe eligible for new lending.
Can I just come in, Madam, and ask and say that you said that it has never been implemented against Zimbabwe. And then business people like Strive Masiwa feel like it has to go. And would it be possible that maybe part of the conditions or possibilities, if Zimbabwe was going to request for special favors or for wavering or for anything to happen because of ZIDERA, they cannot do that?
Well, I think it is this critical point. The economic situation in Zimbabwe has reached this just really dramatic, difficult point right now where new lending is absolutely essential. Zimbabwe has basically dug itself an economic hole that is so deep that lending will be required to get out of the hole. I think with some lending, Zimbabwe's future could be incredibly bright. Given all the resources that are here, Zimbabwe could easily...
So would it be also then possible then to say, at this point, ZIDERA must go or must be lifted?
ZIDERA, what ZIDERA says is that when these economic and political reforms are made, then we will fully support new lending to Zimbabwe. So what I would say is, rather than ZIDERA must go, the requirements for economic and political reforms are things that President Mnangagwa spoke about in his inauguration speech. It's what he spoke about at the opening of Parliament. These are things that President Mnangagwa has stated are his intentions for Zimbabwe anyway. So just follow through on those promises, show us concrete action. It doesn't take long at all. These are simple things. One example could be the repeal of AIPA or POSA, these laws regarding media freedom or regarding freedom of assembly. Those laws could be repealed very quickly by Parliament or by the executive branch here. And they're simple actions, and that's all we're saying is, instead of talking about these things, and we think the government of Zimbabwe is talking about the right things that it knows it needs to do, instead of talking about them, do them. And as soon as they're done, we will be able to support new lending. The requirements of ZIDERA will be satisfied, and we will be able to support new lending to Zimbabwe. So it's not a question of ZIDERA must go. It's a question of Zimbabwe must satisfy the requirements of Zimbabwe.
And hence the sanctions.
Sanctions are separate. Sanctions really are separate. They're about individuals who've committed human rights abuses. And so absolutely the sanctions, anyone who is subject to sanctions can file an individual claim to ask to have themselves removed from sanctions. You started to talk about the difficulties in doing trade in Zimbabwe, and that really is a challenge as we talk about nostro accounts, as we talk about foreign currencies. Anytime someone from Zimbabwe wants to make a purchase from a U.S. company, of course the foreign currency has to get out of Zimbabwe and go to the U.S. bank. That generally has to go through a correspondence bank, one bank that is sort of the intermediary that passes the money from Zimbabwe to the U.S. Those correspondence banks, frankly, are quite nervous because they have read about sanctions and they keep hearing the media talk about sanctions against Zimbabwe, and they're nervous to do transactions. There is no legal impediment to doing trade and transactions between our countries. We have to find banks that are eligible to do the trade and willing and understand that the sanctions are against individuals and not against the country. As soon as we find correspondence banks willing to do the transactions, trade will flow easily. There is a lot of opportunity here in Zimbabwe, a lot of American companies that want to do business here, a lot of Zimbabweans that want to do business with the United States. I think the future is really, really bright, and we just have to work through these correspondence bank issues.
So great explanations there, and already you are already actually now linking the notion of sanctions to how it's already affecting business or the ease of doing business between Zimbabwe and the world. And again, it's a clear indication of the impact of sanctions, even though they're targeted at individuals, but the perception they create across the world in business. So I think in understanding that the position is the government of Zimbabwe has to implement certain things around human rights. I am a human rights activist. I'm in support of that. How do we balance, as we end the program, how do we balance between the understanding that all this is causing difficulty for local business, and maybe there is a desperation in Zimbabwe for the change in perception so that people are able to do business with the world, and also realizing that maybe the new government is not entirely responsible for the sanctions that are there, and therefore maybe are deserving of maybe the removal, or maybe a certain manner in which people are able to do business, but also the government is able to address the issues that are being raised, that are important, by the way, because we have to have the rule of law, we have to have human rights being respected. How do we come to a place where there's an encouragement of the government to do its part, but at the same time realizing that Zimbabweans are the ones who are suffering?
I think we are very much welcoming of the new dispensation. We're welcoming of the new government of Zimbabwe. We recognize that many members of the government are these individuals who are subject to sanctions. They have their own past and their own histories to deal with. But we recognize that they are part of a new government. They are a new dispensation. They are a new way of looking at governing Zimbabwe. And we welcome that very, very much. We would like to see Zimbabwe take steps. But the fact that these individuals have the past that they do is why we say we need to see more than just talk. We need to see concrete actions. As soon as we start to see Zimbabwe follow through on the promises that its leaders have made to the people, we will be right there and ready to review our sanctions program, review ZIDERA, and ready to turn a new page. We just need to see the concrete action, and we would encourage, among those reforms that we're looking for, are human rights reforms. We're looking for a peace and reconciliation process that is active, legitimate, and truly brings some sense of peace and reconciliation to the country.
Great conversations there, as I was just saying that Madam Savage from the U.S. Embassy and the great work that they've done, the great investment, and I'm also a product of that investment. I went on the community solutions in 2012, and our encouragement again is the two countries consider us the people when this is going on. This government of Zimbabwe, the government of the United States, be moved by the people, the women, the children that they are all seeking to service. Until next time, this was great, but we're getting into that session again where you like to hear from us. So today we hear from somebody who says, "Hi to everyone. May I say thank you so much to you guys for this special and wonderful show. To us as young boys and girls, we are really learning something from this." Marlon from Rua. And on that note, citizens, we will meet again next week. Thank you for staying on Identities. Goodbye.